The most disturbing planets in Warhammer 40k. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are countless worlds scattered across 1,000,000 stars. Among the Imperium's domain alone, over 1,000,000 inhabited planets exist, each one a potential stage for humanity's endless wars of survival. But some of these worlds transcend mere danger. Some planets in the Warhammer 40,000 universe aren't just lethal or hostile. They're fundamentally wrong, places where reality itself has been corrupted, where entire civilizations have been twisted into mockeries of life, where the very laws of physics bend to the will of malevolent gods, or where humanity has inflicted such horrors upon itself that the scars will never heal. These aren't the garden worlds where Imperial citizens live in relative peace, nor are they simply the battlefield planets where wars rage. These are worlds that represent the absolute worst that the galaxy has to offer. Places where living is a fate worse than death, where every breath is agony, where hope has been extinguished so thoroughly that even its memory has been forgotten. These are the planets that haunt the nightmares of even the most hardened space marines, that make inquisitors hesitate before signing deployment orders, that serve as cautionary tales whispered in the darkest corners of the Imperium. What makes a planet truly disturbing in Warhammer 40k? It's not simply a high body count or dangerous wildlife. The galaxy is full of death worlds, where monstrous creatures hunt humans for sport, and battlefields where millions die daily. No, what elevates a world to true horror is something deeper. It's the perversion of natural order. It's the systematic destruction of hope. It's the transformation of entire populations into things that should not exist. It's worlds where the barrier between reality and the nightmare realm of the warp has dissolved entirely, where demon princes reshape continents on whims, where the screaming of tortured souls forms a constant background noise that never fades. Some of these planets were corrupted by external forces. The Chaos Gods reach out from their realm in the warp, their foul touch transforming paradise worlds into demon worlds where impossible geometries replace natural physics and the population serves as playthings for entities that feed on suffering. Other worlds fell to their own hubris, rebellions crushed with such extreme prejudice that the planet itself was rendered permanently uninhabitable. Wars fought with such fanatical devotion that every living thing on the surface was reduced to ash and char, leaving only radioactive wastelands where survivors cling to existence in underground tombs. Then there are the planets that represent something even more disturbing. These are worlds where the horrors aren't accidents or the result of war. They're deliberate, places where the forces of chaos have established permanent dominion, building fortress monasteries of flesh and bone, constructing cities powered by the screams of the damned, creating industrial complexes where the product isn't weapons or armor, but suffering itself, distilled and refined into its purest form. Understanding these planets tells us something fundamental about the Warhammer 40,000 universe itself. This isn't a setting where evil is abstract or theoretical. Evil has planets. Evil has cities and fortresses and populations. Evil has industrial output measured in the billions of tormented souls. The grimdark isn't just aesthetic, it's the actual state of reality for countless trillions of beings scattered across the galaxy. The Imperium of man, for all its talk of bringing order and civilization to the galaxy, is stretched impossibly thin. With over 1,000,000 worlds to protect and countless threats pressing in from every side, there simply aren't enough space marines, guard regiments, or inquisitors to prevent every world from falling to darkness. The result is that some planets slip through the cracks. Some rebellions aren't crushed quickly enough. Some warp rifts open before help can arrive. And once a planet has fallen to true corruption, reclaiming it becomes nearly impossible. The taint runs too deep. The population has been transformed beyond recognition. The very soil and stone have been saturated with malevolent energy that resists all attempts at purification. So these worlds endure. The demon worlds remain nestled within the Eye of Terror and other warp storms, launching raids against nearby Imperial space whenever the opportunity presents itself. The dead worlds float, as monuments to past horrors, quarantined and avoided by all but the most desperate or foolish. And the worlds that humanity itself has rendered into nightmares continue to function, their populations ground down into living weapons, their purpose reduced to feeding the Imperium's endless appetite for soldiers and war material. What follows is an exploration of the most disturbing planets in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Not the most dangerous in terms of combat effectiveness, though many of these worlds have claimed countless lives in battle. Not simply the most unpleasant to live on, though all of them represent living hells in their own unique ways. These are the planets that represent the absolute depths of horror that the galaxy has to offer. The places where nightmares are manufactured on an industrial scale. The worlds that make even the darkest Imperial hive cities look like paradise by comparison. From demon worlds where reality itself has been replaced by the fevered dreams of malevolent gods, to planets where humanity's own choices have created permanent scars that can never heal. Each of these locations tells a story about what happens when the thin veneer of civilization is stripped away, and the underlying horror of existence in the 41st millennium is revealed in all its terrible glory. The Plague Planet, Mortarion's Garden of Despair. Deep within the Eye of Terror, where the boundary between reality and the warp has dissolved entirely, there exists a world known to the Imperium only as the Plague Planet. Its true name, if it ever had one, has been lost to history. What remains is Mortarion's ultimate expression of devotion to Nurgle, the chaos god of disease, decay, and despair. This is a world where pestilence is not merely present, but is the fundamental organizing principle of existence itself. The Plague Planet was once called Eliathida, though that name is now known only to a handful of scholars who study the darkest periods of Imperial history. Following the Horus Heresy, when the traitor legions were driven into the Eye of Terror by the vengeful forces of the loyalist Imperium, Mortarion claimed this world as his own. The demon Primarch, having fully embraced his role as Nurgle's favored son, set about reshaping the planet into something that would please his patron god. What emerged from centuries of corruption was a world that defies all natural law, a place where disease is worshipped as divine and suffering is the only constant. From orbit, the Plague Planet appears as a sphere of sickly green and brown, wreathed in clouds of toxic miasma that churn and roil with unnatural life. These aren't weather patterns in any conventional sense. They're living things, vast atmospheric entities composed of viral particles and demonic essence, spreading contagion across the surface with every gust of poisoned wind. Ships approaching the planet must navigate through this biological minefield, and even vessels protected by Geller fields find their hulls corroding, their crews succumbing to plagues that shouldn't be able to penetrate sealed bulkheads. The planet's surface is a nightmare of putrefaction and decay. Where other worlds might have forests or oceans, continents or mountain ranges, the Plague Planet has only rot. Vast bale swamps stretch for thousands of kilometers, their surfaces bubbling with methane and worse things, releasing clouds of spores that can reduce an unprotected human to liquefied flesh in seconds. The swamps themselves are alive in the most disturbing sense. They hunger. They think in the simple, malevolent way that all of Nurgle's creations think. And they feast on anything foolish enough to venture into their toxic embrace. Rising from this landscape of disease are mountains. But these aren't the natural granite peaks found on so many worlds. These mountains are constructed, built from materials that resist categorization. Some appear to be stone infused with organic matter, weeping pus from countless pores. Others seem to be composed entirely of compressed, diseased tissue, held together by demonic will rather than any physical principle. And crowning the 7 greatest of these peaks are the fortresses of the Death Guard's plague companies. Each of the 7 major plague companies maintains its own fortress monastery on the Plague Planet, and each has transformed their stronghold to reflect their particular interpretation of Nurgle's gifts. These aren't mere military installations. They're massive complexes that combine fortress, temple, and laboratory into structures that can rival the greatest works of Imperial architecture. If architecture could be said to describe buildings that grow and mutate like living things. The fortresses bristle with defensive weaponry. Defense laser batteries capable of striking targets in low orbit dot their walls. Anti-orbital guns of such massive caliber that their ammunition must be hauled into place by demonic engines aim skyward, ready to obliterate any vessel foolish enough to approach without proper authorization. Trans-atmospheric docking facilities allow the plague fleets to resupply and refit, their crews spreading contagion wherever they go. And deep within each fortress are the plague laboratories, chambers where Death Guard plague surgeons experiment with creating new diseases, new ways to spread Nurgle's gifts to an ungrateful galaxy. But greatest of all these fortresses, so massive that it dwarfs even its closest rivals, is the Black Manse, also known as the Whispering Tower. This structure serves as Mortarian's personal domain. It stretches between the 3 highest peaks on the entire planet, a fortress so vast that it can be seen from orbit, resembling from space the tri-lobe symbol of Nurgle himself. This is no coincidence. The Black Manse was designed to be visible as a sign of devotion, a monument that can be seen across the gulf between reality and the warp. Within the Black Manse are dungeons that extend deep into the planet's core, laboratories where the most forbidden experiments are conducted, and throne rooms where Mortarion, the skeletal demon Primarch, sits in state, much as his false father once sat upon Barbarous so long ago. The comparison is deliberate. Mortarion shaped this world to resemble his homeworld, or rather, to resemble what Barbarous would have been if Nurgle's influence had been present from the beginning. It's a twisted recreation, a perverse homage to a world that Mortarion both loved and hated. The libraries of the Black Manse house some of the most dangerous texts in the entire galaxy. Mouldering tomes fill endless shelves, their covers dripping with filth, their pages moaning like bloated corpses when turned. Among these forbidden volumes are the 7 books of woe, aberrations so vile that merely reading them aloud can tear holes in reality itself. Mortarion occasionally bestows one of these books upon a particularly favored champion, granting them the power to summon demon legions or even transform entire planets into befouled hellscapes during cursed stellar conjunctions. The mortal inhabitants of the plague planet live lives of unimaginable suffering. They cower in tiny villages scattered across the toxic landscape, their bodies afflicted with every disease imaginable and some that shouldn't be possible outside of nightmare. They pray constantly to Nurgle for relief from their agony, and occasionally their prayers are answered. But Nurgle's mercy is as terrible as his curses. Those who receive his favor become his champions, their diseases growing more virulent, their bodies transforming into walking plague vectors. They then fight among themselves for dominance, for the chance to prove their worth, and possibly ascend to become demon princes themselves. The beastmen population, known as pestigores, make up a large proportion of the plague planet's mortal inhabitants. These abhumans are bloated with disease, their bodies swollen with tumors and lesions, flies swarming in clouds around their rotting flesh. Far from being ashamed of their condition, the pestigores wear their diseases as badges of honor. They boast to one another about the number and severity of their afflictions, comparing pustules and poxes like warriors comparing battle scars. To them, each new disease is a blessing from Grandfather Nurgle, proof of his favor and attention. Diseased things that should be dead roam the planet's surface. These aren't merely sick animals or mutated humans. They're entities that have died but refuse to stop moving, animated by the same demonic energy that saturates every atom of the plague planet's matter. The most famous of these abominations is the Foulspawn, a creature so disgusting that even Death Guard Marines speak of it with a mixture of awe and revulsion. Its exact nature is unclear, as descriptions vary wildly depending on who's telling the story, but all accounts agree on one thing. Seeing the Foulspawn is an experience that haunts the viewer forever after. The air itself is lethal. Clouds of contagion pollute the atmosphere, carrying viral payloads so virulent that a single breath would kill an unprotected human in seconds. Even sealed environment suits provide only temporary protection. The diseases of the plague planet are persistent. They can penetrate power armor, corrode ceramite, and infect even servitors and other mechanical constructs. Only the Death Guard themselves, their bodies long since transformed beyond recognition by Nurgle's gifts, can walk the surface without protection and survive. Deep within the Bale Swamps lies a structure known as the Peel Yard. This fortress factory exists at an interstice, a point where reality and the warp overlap so completely that distinguishing between them becomes impossible. Here, Damon Smiths work ceaselessly, forging the bells known as toxins of misery. These aren't ordinary bells. They're cast from the screams of dying psychers. Their metal infused with so much psychic anguish that merely hearing them ring can drive lesser beings mad. Death Guard noxious Blightbringers carry these bells into battle, their tolling spreading despair and disease in equal measure. The process of creating a toxin of misery is as horrific as might be expected. Psychers captured from across the Imperium are brought to the Peel Yard, where they're subjected to tortures specifically designed to maximize their psychic screaming. As they die, their death screams are captured, bound into molten metal, and forged into the shape of bells. The resulting artifacts are simultaneously weapons and religious icons, tools of war and objects of worship. Each bell is unique, its tone determined by the particular agonies of the psychers who died in its creation. The Plague Planet serves another crucial function, beyond being Mortarian's personal domain. It's a staging ground for invasions. Its location within the Eye of Terror places it relatively close to the border with real space, particularly near the region that once included the Cadian sector, before Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade shattered Cadia and created the Great Rift. This proximity makes it an ideal launching point for plague fleets, carrying Death Guard and their mortal followers to nearby Imperial worlds. The defense systems of the Plague Planet are formidable enough to repel all but the most determined assaults. In addition to the weapons mounted on the 7 great fortresses, the planet itself is a weapon. The atmosphere actively resists invasion. Drop pods and thunderhawks attempting to breach the miasmic clouds find their systems failing, their hulls corroding, their passengers dying before they ever reach the surface. Teleportation becomes unreliable, as the boundary between reality and warp is so thin that teleporting units often materialize inside solid matter or scattered across kilometers of toxic wasteland. Even orbital bombardment proves less effective than it should be, as the same demonic energies that animate the planet allow it to regenerate damage with disturbing speed. For any Imperial force contemplating an assault on the Plague Planet, the outlook is grim. The Death Guard are entrenched in fortifications that have had 10,000 years to develop and strengthen. The population, such as it is utterly devoted to Nurgle and will fight with the fanaticism of true believers. The environment itself is hostile to all life except that which serves the Plague God, and even if an attacking force somehow managed to claim a beachhead, they would immediately begin succumbing to diseases that no amount of medical attention can cure. The Plague Planet stands as perhaps the purest example of what happens when a world falls completely under the dominion of chaos. It's not merely conquered or corrupted. It's transformed at a fundamental level into something that exists to serve the whims of a chaos god. Every element of the planet, from the smallest microbe to the greatest mountain, exists only to spread disease and despair. The inhabitants don't merely worship Nurgle out of fear or obligation. They genuinely believe that their suffering is holy, that their diseases are blessings, that their miserable existence represents the highest form of devotion possible. This is what makes the Plague Planet so deeply disturbing. It's not a temporary condition that could be fixed with sufficient military force. It's a permanent transformation. The planet cannot be reclaimed or purified. It is, in every meaningful sense, lost forever. Even if the Death Guard were somehow driven off or destroyed, the planet itself would remain a toxic wasteland, saturated with so much demonic energy that it could never support normal life again. It would have to be destroyed entirely, and even that might not be enough to cleanse the stain it represents on reality itself. Sortiarius, the planet of the sorcerers. If the plague planet represents disease made manifest, then Sortiarius, the planet of the sorcerers, represents the perversion of knowledge itself. This demon world serves as the current homeworld of the Thousand Suns traitor legion, and it embodies everything that makes that legion so deeply wrong. Here, the pursuit of arcane wisdom has been taken to such extremes that reality itself has become optional. Physics are suggestions rather than laws, and the very concept of truth has been warped beyond recognition. Sortiarius was not always located in the Eye of Terror, though determining where it came from originally is complicated by the fact that demon worlds don't necessarily have origins in any conventional sense. Some scholars believe it was created whole by Tzinch, the chaos god of change and sorcery, specifically to house his favored sons after the fall of Prospero. Others argue that it was dragged from somewhere in real space, transformed by sorcerous ritual into its current state. The truth, if such a concept even applies to a demon world, probably lies somewhere between these extremes. What is known is that when Magnus the Red used his sorcerous powers to transport the surviving Thousand Suns from Prospero at the end of their legion's war with the Space Wolves, they arrived on Sortiarius. Here they found not just shelter, but a world that seemed designed specifically for their needs. The City of Light, Tizca, the great capital of Prospero with all its libraries and monuments, had been transported as well, either by Magnus's power or by Tzinch's will. It now stands as the central settlement on Sortiarius, a beacon of impossible architecture rising from a landscape that defies description. The planet itself orbits a star, or what passes for a star, in the twisted physics of the Eye of Terror. This stellar object is nothing like the stable fusion reactions that power stars in real space. Instead, it's a constantly changing orb that passes through 9 different phases, waxing and waning in patterns that seem random, but are probably dictated by some logic only Tzinch understands. The light it casts is wrong. Colors appear that don't exist in normal space. Shadows fall in directions that defy geometry. And the stellar radiation, if it can be called that, carries not heat and energy, but pure change itself. The skies above Sortiarius are storms of warp energy. These aren't weather systems. They're manifestations of raw chaos, swirling masses of impossible colors and shapes that constantly shift and mutate. Lightning arcs between clouds composed of crystallized possibility. Thunder sounds like laughter, or screaming, or words in languages that were never meant to be spoken. Looking up at the sky of Sortiarius for too long can drive mortals mad, as their minds struggle to process sensory input that contradicts everything they know about how reality should function. The surface of the world is equally impossible. When the Thousand Suns first arrived, they found it unpopulated, a blank slate waiting to be shaped. Over the millennia since, they've transformed it into a reflection of their twisted priorities. Towers of impossible height stretch toward the turbulent sky, their architecture incorporating geometries that shouldn't be able to exist in 3-dimensional space. Some appear to loop back on themselves without ever connecting. Others seem to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, and the tallest of all, dwarfing even its closest rivals, is the Tower of the Cyclops. This obsidian monolith serves as Magnus the Red's personal sanctum. It's also known as the Obsidian Tower, and it's staffed by thousands of servants and guards. But the tower's most notable feature is the great glowing eye that adorns its peak. This isn't merely decorative. It's a sorcerous construct of immense power, capable of gazing through the warp into real space itself. Magnus uses this eye to search the Imperium for arcane artifacts and gifted psykers. When he finds something that interests him, he dispatches raiding parties to capture it and bring it back to Sortiarius. The Tower of the Cyclops embodies everything wrong with the Thousand Suns' approach to knowledge. They seek wisdom, not to benefit humanity or to serve any noble purpose, but purely for the sake of accumulation. They're scholars who've become hoarders, collecting forbidden lore and dangerous artifacts, without any consideration for whether doing so is wise or ethical. The Tower's libraries contain texts that could destroy worlds if their secrets were unleashed. Its vaults hold relics that should have been destroyed long ago, and Magnus sits at its heart like a spider in a web, always watching, always searching for more knowledge to consume. Surrounding the Tower of the Cyclops are the other great structures of Sortiarius. The Pyramid of Sorcerous Arts houses the training halls where new sorcerers learn to channel the warp's power. The Library of Tizca contains thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, some of it predating the fall of the Eldar. The Temple of Tzeentch, where the Thousand Sons pay homage to their patron god, features architecture that actively changes as you move through it. Corridors that lead to different locations each time they're traversed. Rooms that exist in multiple configurations simultaneously. But not all of Sortiarius is given over to grand monuments and impossible architecture. The planet has a dark underbelly that the Thousand Sons rarely acknowledge. The Spawn Pit is a sanity-warping tangle of tunnels and caverns that exists beneath the surface. This is where the Thousand Sons cast their failures, the sorcerers whose attempts to master warp energies went catastrophically wrong and transformed them into chaos spawn. These wretched creatures inhabit the Spawn Pit, a nightmarish labyrinth that changes constantly, its passages folding back on themselves, its chambers existing in states that defy conventional description. The inhabitants of Sortiarius represent a cross-section of the various peoples the Thousand Sons have enslaved over millennia of raiding. Thousands of years of captures have created a substantial servant underclass. Some of these servants are treated relatively well, by the standards of Chaos Space Marines at least. They're allowed to perform their duties, maintain the towers and monuments, and serve their masters with something approaching normalcy. But others have escaped into the wildlands beyond the cities, forming nomadic warbands that roam the inhospitable wastes. These warbands are led by powerful mortals who've risen from the ranks of escaped servants, individuals with enough strength and cunning to survive in a landscape where the laws of nature are optional at best. Some of these warlords are eventually recruited back into service by the Thousand Sons, who recognize useful talent when they see it. Others remain independent, carving out small kingdoms in the wilderness, constantly fighting to maintain their territory against both demonic incursions and rival warbands. A notable portion of the population consists of Tzangors, beastmen mutated by exposure to Tzeentchian energies. These subhumans have developed over thousands of years into a subordinate warrior caste. Their bodies are a fusion of human and avian features, with beaked faces, taloned hands, and feathers that shimmer with unnatural colors. They're more intelligent than typical beastmen, capable of understanding complex orders and executing sophisticated battle plans. The Thousand Sons use them as shock troops and expendable soldiers, roles that the Tzangors fill with fanatical devotion to the Changer of Ways. The Thousand Sons also maintain significant industrial capabilities on Sortiarius. Through pacts with the Dark Mechanicum, they've established corrupted manufactoria that produce the weapons and war gear their legion requires. These facilities churn out bolter ammunition, power armor components, and more exotic equipment that normal Forge worlds couldn't produce. They also create demon engines, unholy fusions of machine and warp entity that serve as vehicles and weapons for chaos forces. Creating a demon engine is a process that perfectly encapsulates the horror of what the Thousand Sons have become. It requires binding a demon into a mechanical construct, forcing a sentient entity of pure chaos into a form that constrains and directs its power. The demon resists, naturally. It doesn't want to be bound. But through sorcerous ritual and technological innovation, the Dark Mechanicum have perfected methods of forcing compliance. The resulting engines are alive in the most disturbing sense, their machine spirits twisted into something that screams in rage and hunger as they're deployed into battle. Sortiarius serves as a staging ground for the Thousand Sons' endless raids into real space. The planet's location, deep within the Eye of Terror, keeps it relatively safe from Imperial counterattack, while various sorcerous portals and warp rifts allow rapid deployment to targets across the galaxy. When Magnus identifies an artifact he wants, or a psyker he wishes to capture, Thousand Suns forces can be on site within days or even hours, striking with devastating precision before vanishing back into the warp. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Sortiarius isn't its impossible architecture, or its enslaved population, or even its role as a base for raiding parties. It's what the planet represents philosophically. This is what happens when the pursuit of knowledge becomes untethered from all moral considerations. The Thousand Suns sought wisdom above all else, and they achieved it. They learned secrets that other species feared to pursue. They mastered sorcerous techniques that could reshape reality itself. And in doing so, they damned themselves and everyone around them. The Thousand Suns once believed that knowledge was inherently good, that understanding the universe would elevate humanity. But Sortiarius proves otherwise. Here, knowledge has become a curse. The more the Thousand Suns learn, the deeper they sink into corruption. Their search for understanding has transformed them into monsters who serve a god that represents change for its own sake, improvement toward no goal, transformation without purpose. They've become scholars without wisdom, researchers without ethics, teachers who can only corrupt their students. Recently, through a sorcerous ritual of immense power, Magnus managed to transport Sortiarius from the Eye of Terror back into real space. The planet now orbits in the same system as Prospero, the Thousand Suns' original homeworld. The two planets now circle the same sun, a sun that has become an omen of doom visible across the Imperium. This return represents a statement of intent. The Thousand Suns are back, and they're no longer content to hide in the Eye of Terror. They've brought their demon world into the Emperor's realm, a physical manifestation of corruption that can't be ignored. The implications are staggering. A demon world existing in real space represents a permanent wound in reality, a location where the laws of physics are optional and the warp bleeds through constantly. Sortiarius now serves as a bridgehead, a staging point for incursions that can strike directly at Imperial space without requiring passage through the warp. It's a development that has Imperial strategists deeply concerned, as countering it would require a military campaign on a scale that the Imperium can barely afford. Medrengard, Perturabo's Iron Hell. Among the demon worlds claimed by traitor primarchs, Medrengard holds a unique position. Where other daemon worlds embrace the baroque impossibilities of chaos aesthetics, Medrengard is almost mundane in its horror. This is the domain of Perturabo, demon prince and former primarch of the Iron Warriors Legion, and it reflects his character perfectly: cold, methodical, brutal, efficient, and utterly devoid of mercy or hope. The most frequently reported description of Medrengard comes from Imperial psychers who've experienced visions of the planet in their nightmares. They describe a dead sky, a white void, devoid of stars or clouds, or any feature except the black sun that hangs motionless at its apex. This sun doesn't shine in any conventional sense. Instead of light, it pours down smoky threads of darkness onto the planet's surface, covering everything in a sooty residue that never washes away, never disperses, just accumulates endlessly. The planet's surface is one vast fortress. Where other worlds have cities separated by wilderness or oceans breaking up landmasses, Medrengard is entirely urbanized in the most brutal way imaginable. Fortress complexes rise to impossible heights, towers that stretch kilometers into the dead sky, their walls bristling with weapons emplacements and defensive systems. Between these fortresses run trenches and bunkers, defensive works that extend for thousands of kilometers, creating a network of fortifications that covers the entire planetary surface. This isn't organic growth or natural development. It's deliberate construction on an almost incomprehensible scale. Perturabo, during his 10,000 years of exile in the Eye of Terror, has transformed his demon world into the ultimate expression of siege warfare. Every structure is a fortress. Every fortress is designed to withstand any conceivable assault, while simultaneously serving as a base for launching counterattacks. The entire planet is essentially one enormous castle, with layers of defense that would take centuries to breach, even if an attacking force faced no resistance. The dungeons of Medrengard extend deep into the planet's core, deeper than should be physically possible. Ships' crews who've been captured and interrogated speak of being taken downward for what felt like days, descending through level after level of prisons and torture chambers, never reaching what seemed like the bottom. The planet's interior has been hollowed out and reshaped, transformed into a labyrinth of passages and chambers where slaves are worked to death in conditions that make standard Imperial factory worlds look merciful by comparison. Perturabo himself resides in the Eternal Fortress, the grandest structure on a planet defined by grand structures. This fortress monastery exceeds in size and defensive capability anything his subordinate warsmiths have managed to construct, a fact that Perturabo ensures remains true through constant vigilance and occasional violence. The Eternal Fortress contains everything the Iron Warriors need to maintain their campaigns of terror across the galaxy. Forges produce weapons and ammunition. Shipyards construct and repair vessels. And deep within its central keep, Perturabo sits upon his throne, plotting strategy and nursing grudges that have festered for millennia. The population of Medrengard consists primarily of slaves. Over 10,000 years, the Iron Warriors have captured millions of humans from worlds across the Imperium, transporting them to their demon world to serve as labor. These slaves maintain the fortresses, work in the forges, dig new tunnels and passages, and generally keep the planet's infrastructure functioning. They do so under conditions of unimaginable brutality, watched constantly by Iron Warriors' overseers, who view them as nothing more than expendable tools. Life expectancy for a slave on Medrengard is measured in months rather than years. The work is backbreaking, the rations insufficient, and the punishments for any perceived failure are severe. Slaves who collapse from exhaustion are simply left where they fall, their bodies cleared away when convenient. Those who try to escape face worse fates, often being subjected to the attentions of the Iron Warriors' warpsmiths, sorcerer engineers who need test subjects for their experiments in binding demons to machinery. But the greatest horror of Medrengard, the thing that makes even other Chaos Space Marines speak of it with disgust, is the Demon Kolaba. This was a creation of Warsmith Honsu, an Iron Warrior who sought to create a method for rapidly producing new Chaos Space Marines. The name itself derives from daemon and incubula, a hint at the unholy fusion of warpcraft and biological science that the project represented. The process was almost unbearably grotesque. Female slaves were force-fed nutrients that caused their bodies to bloat to grotesque proportions. Then, using a combination of surgical techniques and chaos sorcery, the savage morticians, heretic tech priests in service to chaos, would radically alter these women's internal morphology. Their wombs were transformed into incubation chambers, implanted with stolen gene seed from captured loyalist space marines. Then, adolescent male slaves were sealed inside these living incubators through a procedure that was essentially a reverse cesarean section. Days later, if the process worked, the adolescent would emerge reborn as a new Chaos Space Marine. But there was a catch. The newly created Astartes would lack skin, their muscle tissue and ceramite-fused skeleton exposed to air. If they'd survived the metabolic shock of the transformation, they'd be inspected for physical worthiness. Those deemed acceptable would be accepted into the Iron Warriors' ranks. Those who'd mutated too severely during the process were flushed through the sewers to die in the wastes surrounding Kalangol, the fortress where the Demon Kolaba was maintained. But some of these rejects survived. They escaped into the wilderness of Medrengard, forming a tribe known as the Unfleshed. These mutants were technically still human, possessing some level of intelligence and even rudimentary moral codes. But their bodies were horribly malformed, each one unique, in its grotesque configuration. They lived as scavengers, hunting for food in a landscape where almost nothing was edible, constantly fleeing from Iron Warriors' patrols, and nursing a collective trauma that none of them could fully express. The Unfleshed eventually played a crucial role in the destruction of the Demoncolaba. When two Ultramarines, Captain Uriel Ventris and Sergeant Pausanias Lysane, arrived on Medrengard to fulfill a death oath that required them to destroy such an abomination, the Unfleshed allied with them. In the assault on Kalangol, many of the mutants died, but their sacrifice allowed Ventris and his companion to reach the heart of the facility and destroy it. The surviving Unfleshed escaped Medrengard with the Ultramarines, beginning a journey that would eventually lead them to a small measure of peace, or at least an end to their suffering. The destruction of the Demoncolaba represents one of the few victories against the horrors of Medrengard, but it changed nothing fundamental about the planet. The fortresses remain. The slaves continue to suffer. The Iron Warriors prosecute their campaigns against the Imperium with the same methodical brutality they've always employed. And Perturabo sits on his throne, brooding over slights real and imagined, plotting vengeance against the Imperium that, in his twisted view, never appreciated his genius. What makes Medrengard so disturbing compared to other demon worlds is its lack of excess. There are no impossible geometries here, no landscapes that shift and change on a whim. The planet operates according to recognizable, if perverted, principles. It's a prison planet, a factory world, and a military fortress combined into one. It's what happens when a being of incredible intellect and capability decides to devote their talents entirely to creating suffering on an industrial scale. The planet also serves as a grim illustration of what the Iron Warriors have become. Once they were the Emperor's siege specialists, the Legion called upon when no one else could break through an enemy's defenses. They were bitter and resentful even then, feeling that their crucial contributions went unrecognized while other legions received glory and honors. But at least they served a purpose beyond themselves, contributing to the Great Crusade's mission of reuniting humanity. Now they've devolved into warbands of pirates and raiders. Each warsmith commands their own grand company, effectively operating as an independent warlord. They fight not for any grand strategic objective, but simply to acquire resources, slaves, and gene seed for creating new Iron Warriors. The Legion has become fragmented, with warsmiths occasionally battling each other for dominance. Some speculate that Perturabo deliberately orchestrates these internal conflicts, weeding out weakness from his Legion through a form of social Darwinism that cares nothing for the cost in lives or resources. Medrengard stands as a monument to wasted potential. Perturabo is one of the most intelligent beings in the entire galaxy, a genius in matters of siege warfare, fortification, and military logistics. He could have been the Imperium's greatest defender, the architect of impregnable defenses that would have protected humanity from external threats. Instead, he's become a demon prince, devoted to tearing down everything he once might have built. His fortress world represents not achievement, but the perversion of achievement, capability turned entirely toward destruction and suffering. Imperial strategists occasionally discuss the possibility of launching an assault on Medrengard, destroying the Iron Warriors' home base and crippling their ability to project power into real space. These discussions always end the same way. The cost would be prohibitive. The planet's defenses are too strong, its garrison too numerous, and the strategic value of success too uncertain. Even if an Imperial force somehow managed to fight their way to Perturabo's eternal fortress, killing a demon prince is nearly impossible, and his death would likely just result in his eventual resurrection in the warp. So Medrengard endures. Slaves die in their millions, work to death in forges and factories. The Iron Warriors maintain their fortresses and plot their next campaigns. Perturabo nurses his grudges and perfects his art of siege warfare, creating ever more elaborate defensive systems that will never be tested against a worthy opponent. And the black sun continues to pour its smoky darkness down onto the white sky, covering everything in a layer of soot that symbolizes perfectly the spiritual corruption of everything the Iron Warriors have become. Sycharis, the cathedral of endless faith. Beneath a sky of roiling fire and blood, the daemon world of Sycharis represents perhaps the most philosophically disturbing of all chaos holdings. This is the domain of Lorga Aurelian, the demon primarch of the Word-Bearers Legion, and it embodies his twisted vision of faith taken to its absolute extreme. Where the plague planet revels in disease and Medrengard in cold efficiency, Sycharis is devoted entirely to worship. Unending, fanatical, all-consuming worship of the ruinous powers in their aspect as chaos undivided. The planet's most striking feature, visible even from orbit, is that it has no natural landscape remaining. Everything has been covered. Every square kilometer of surface area has been transformed into a sprawling mass of cathedrals, temples, and monuments dedicated to chaos. These aren't small structures built to human scale. They're massive constructions, some reaching kilometers into the blood-red sky, their spires crowned with symbols that burn with unholy light. The architecture incorporates elements from thousands of different cultures, a grotesque fusion of design philosophies unified only by their common purpose of glorifying the dark gods. The construction never stops. Millions of slaves toil constantly, raising new structures of devotion atop the existing ones. Spider-legged cranes, themselves unholy fusions of machine and demon, lumber across the landscape, their many limbs working to hoist massive stone blocks into place. These blocks aren't carved from ordinary stone. They're hewn from materials that resist identification, sometimes seeming to be rock, sometimes appearing more organic, as if the structures are being built from compressed and fossilized flesh. This endless construction creates a unique architectural problem. As new levels are built upon existing structures, the older buildings become subterranean. The result is a labyrinthine network of underground passages connecting structures that were once at ground level. Some of these buried complexes are still used for worship or other purposes. Others have been abandoned, left to decay in the darkness. And still others have become something else entirely, transformed by the demonic energies that saturate Sycharis into spaces where reality functions differently. Navigating the underground warrens of Sycharis is a form of madness. Corridors that should lead back to where they started instead open onto entirely different locations. Rooms exist in multiple configurations simultaneously, their layout depending on who's observing them and from what angle. Time itself becomes unreliable, with travelers sometimes emerging hours before they entered, or years after. The word-bearers have learned to navigate these spaces through long practice and careful ritual, but outsiders inevitably become lost, wandering until they die of thirst or fall victim to something worse. The seat of power on Sycharis is the Basilica of the Word, an immense cathedral fortress that serves as the meeting place for the Dark Council. This council consists of the eldest and most powerful Dark Apostles of the Word-Bearers Legion, the veterans who survived the Horus heresy and have continued to prosecute the Long War for 10,000 years. The basilica itself is crowned with hundreds of 5-kilometer-high barbed spires. Each spire is studded with jagged spikes, and upon each spike are impaled living sacrifices, humans who scream endlessly as they slowly die over the course of days or weeks. These aren't merely decorative torture victims. They serve a religious purpose, at least from the word-bearer's perspective. Their screams are prayers, offered to the chaos gods through the medium of suffering. Their pain is devotion made manifest. Their slow deaths are worship in its purest form. The Dark Apostles consider the screaming from the basilica's spires to be a form of sacred music, a hymn that never ends and never needs to, as new sacrifices are constantly added to replace those who finally expire. But the Basilica of the Word, for all its horror, is not the most significant structure on Sycharis. That distinction belongs to the Templum Inficio, a massive complex that remains hidden even from the Wordbearer's own battle brothers. Here resides Lorgar himself, deep in a meditation that has remained unbroken since the Wordbearers fled into the Eye of Terror 10,000 years ago. The demon Primarch sits in solitude, contemplating the nature of chaos and communion with the ruinous powers. He has forbidden anyone to disturb his meditation, and that order has been respected, for the most part, for the entire 10 millennia of his seclusion. What Lorgar seeks in his endless meditation is a matter of speculation. Some believe he's attempting to achieve perfect understanding of the Chaos Gods and their relationship to humanity. Others suggest he's working out the final steps of some grand plan that will bring about the Imperium's complete destruction. Still others, more cynically, argue that he's simply hiding, unable to face the reality that his visions of a universe united under chaos worship haven't come to pass despite 10,000 years of effort. Whatever the truth, Lorgar's absence from active leadership has left the Wordbearers under the control of the Dark Council, and they've proven more than capable of continuing their corrupting work throughout the Imperium. The Wordbearers operate differently from other traitor legions. Where most have fragmented into competing warbands, the Wordbearers maintain substantial unity and organization. This is partly due to their religious structure. They're not merely soldiers, they're priests of chaos. The Dark Apostles serve as both military commanders and spiritual leaders, binding the Legion together through shared faith rather than simple loyalty or fear. This religious cohesion has allowed them to maintain a level of coordination that most other traitor legions can't match. Their primary mission hasn't changed since before the Horus Heresy. They seek to corrupt the Imperium from within, spreading chaos worship across human space through the sponsorship of cults and the encouragement of rebellion. They don't always need to deploy in force. Sometimes a single wordbearer operating covertly can establish a chaos cult that will do far more damage than an entire warband conducting open warfare. They're patient, willing to work across generations if necessary, planting seeds of corruption that might not bear fruit for decades or even centuries. The population of Sikaris consists largely of slaves captured during raids and devoted cultists who've earned the privilege of living in proximity to their gods. These inhabitants lead lives defined entirely by worship. There are no leisure activities, no personal time, no concept of self beyond service to chaos. From the moment they wake until the moment they collapse in exhaustion, they're either working to construct new monuments, performing in prayer hordes, or engaging in rituals designed to please the dark gods. The prayer hordes are a unique feature of Sikaris. These are vast gatherings of millions of humans who've been whipped into frenzied devotion. They chant constantly, their voices raised in hymns of praise to the ruinous powers. The sound of these hordes can be heard across kilometers of landscape, a constant background noise that never ceases. The chanters don't eat or sleep in any conventional sense. They're sustained by whatever demonic energies they channel through their worship, kept alive far past the point where normal humans would have collapsed and died. Individual members of these prayer hordes eventually burn out, consumed by the very forces they're channeling. When this happens, they're simply replaced by new cultists. The hordes must never stop, never pause, never fall silent. Their worship serves a purpose beyond mere devotion. The psychic energy they generate feeds the Chaos Gods directly, making them stronger, allowing them to project more power into real space. In this sense, Sikaris is a factory, but what it produces isn't weapons or ships. It produces faith itself, distilled and directed toward the ruinous powers. The wordbearers themselves spend much of their time on Sikaris in contemplation and prayer when not deployed on campaigns. They study the texts housed in the planet's countless libraries, seeking deeper understanding of chaos and how to better serve the dark gods. These libraries contain some of the most dangerous knowledge in existence. Forbidden grimoires teach rituals that can summon greater demons or transform entire worlds. Philosophical texts argue for the inevitability of chaos victory and the futility of resisting it. Historical accounts document 10,000 years of corruption and betrayal across the Imperium. The Word-bearers are also responsible for creating new Dark Apostles when the old ones fall in battle. This process involves intensive indoctrination and testing that can last for decades. Aspirants must prove not only their combat capabilities, but their absolute devotion to chaos. They must be willing to perform any act, no matter how vile, if it serves the ruinous powers. They must be able to preach with such conviction that they can convert even the most faithful servants of the Emperor. And they must be cunning enough to operate independently, establishing and maintaining chaos cults across hostile Imperial space with minimal support. When a Dark Apostle dies, their body is brought back to Sicarus and buried in the unholy soil. This isn't mere sentiment. The Word-bearers believe that the demon world itself is sacred, that burying their fallen in its earth allows them to become part of something greater. Whether there's any truth to this belief is unclear, but the practice continues, and certain areas of Sicarus have become vast graveyards where thousands of Word-bearers have been interred over the millennia. Sicarus also serves as a staging ground for the Word-bearers' military operations. Though they prefer subtle corruption to open warfare, they're more than capable of conducting conventional campaigns when necessary. The planet maintains shipyards and armories, forges that produce weapons and armor, and training grounds where Word-bearers practice the arts of war. They're particularly skilled in combined arms operations, coordinating mortal cultists, chaos space marines, and summon demons into cohesive battle forces. What makes Sicarus truly disturbing isn't its endless construction, or its torture-covered spires, or even its prayer hordes. It's what the planet represents as a concept. This is what happens when faith becomes entirely detached from morality. The Word-bearers are utterly sincere in their devotion. They genuinely believe that the Chaos Gods are worthy of worship, that serving them is the highest calling possible, that spreading their influence across the galaxy is a noble goal. They're not cynical or nihilistic. They're true believers, and that makes them more dangerous than any number of simple pirates or raiders. The Word-bearers see no contradiction in worshipping gods that feed on suffering and corruption. To them, these gods are simply reality's fundamental truth. The Imperium's attempts to deny chaos, to pretend that faith in the Emperor can hold back the tide, are delusional in the Word-bearers' view. They're trying to help humanity by awakening it to what they see as religious truth. The fact that this awakening involves corruption, mutation, demonic possession, and eventual damnation doesn't trouble them at all. These are just the inevitable consequences of true enlightenment. Sicarus embodies this twisted philosophy in stone and blood. Every cathedral is an argument for chaos supremacy. Every chanting cultist is evidence of the dark god's power. Every word-bearer operating covertly in Imperial space carries with them the certainty that they're right, that their faith is justified, that their victory is inevitable. And that certainty, more than any weapon or spell, makes them truly terrifying opponents. Istvan III, the first betrayal, the eternal grave. Among all the disturbing planets in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, few carry the same weight of historical significance as Istvan III. This was once a civilized world, home to over 12 billion people, a planet with cities and culture and all the trappings of Imperial civilization. Now it's a dead rock, a mass necropolis floating through space as a permanent memorial to the moment when everything went wrong, when brother turned against brother, and when the galaxy learned that the Warmaster Horus had fallen to chaos. In the closing years of the Great Crusade, Istvan III was brought into Imperial compliance by the Raven Guard Legion under Primarch Corvus Corax. The world wasn't particularly notable, just another addition to the Imperium's ever-expanding domain. It developed into a prosperous civilized world over the following decades. Its capital city, Krivanak, translated as the Coral City, becoming a center of culture and learning. The population numbered over 12 billion at its peak, living lives that were probably far from paradise by our standards, but were comfortable enough by the brutal metrics of the 41st millennium. Everything changed when the planetary governor, Baron Vardus Pral, decided to rebel against imperial rule. The reasons for his rebellion are complex and somewhat obscure, involving corruption by Slaneshi cults that had infiltrated the planet's government and population. Pral declared independence and began purging imperial elements from his world. This rebellion went unnoticed by the Council of Terra for nearly 6 years, a testament to how stretched thin the Imperium's administrative apparatus had become. When word finally reached Terra, the Council dispatched what should have been overwhelming force to crush the rebellion. 4 full Space Marine legions were assigned to the campaign: the Sons of Horus, under War Master Horus himself, the Emperor's children, under Lord Commander Eidolon in Fulgrim's absence, the Death Guard under Mortarion, and the World Eaters under Angron. This represented one of the largest concentrations of Astartes' power assembled for any single operation during the Great Crusade. What the Emperor and his council didn't know was that these 4 legions had already fallen to chaos. Horus had been corrupted on Davin, transformed from the Emperor's most trusted son into a servant of the ruinous powers. He'd spent months carefully converting his brother, Primarchs, and their legions, spreading corruption through the ranks of the Astartes. The campaign against Istvan III was never intended to be a standard compliance action. It was meant to be a purge. Within each of the 4 traitor legions were elements that hadn't fallen to chaos. Space Marines who remained loyal to the Emperor. Some were Terran-born veterans who'd served since before their Primarchs were found. Others were simply too devoted to their oaths to betray them, no matter what arguments or revelations Horus presented. These loyalists posed a problem for the War Master. He couldn't begin his rebellion with potential traitors in his ranks. They needed to be eliminated, and Istvan III would be where it happened. Horus's plan was coldly efficient. He selected the Space Marines he couldn't trust and assigned them to the first wave of the planetary assault. These loyalists were given what appeared to be a standard mission: deploy via drop pod to the Coral City and secure key objectives against the rebels. They had no way of knowing they'd been selected for death. Their Primarchs, the fathers they'd fought and bled for across hundreds of campaigns, had marked them for execution. The initial deployment went as planned. The loyalist elements from all 4 legions descended on the Coral City in a massive drop pod assault. They secured their objectives with the efficiency that Space Marines were known for, facing surprisingly fierce resistance from Pral's forces, but ultimately prevailing. The Emperor's children assaulted the Precentor's palace. The World Eaters landed in the central plaza. The Death Guard took the outer bunker network, and the Sons of Horus attacked the Siren Hold, an ancient complex where the most powerful of Pral's Psyker warriors were based. Then, at the moment of what should have been victory, the betrayal was revealed. Horus gave the order that would echo through history. 3 words that captured perfectly the horror of what was about to happen: let the galaxy burn. Virus bombs began raining down on Istvan III. These weapons deployed a pathogen called the Life Eater virus, one of the most terrifyingly effective biological weapons ever created. The virus was extraordinarily virulent, capable of spreading across an entire planetary surface in minutes if optimal dispersal was achieved. It could penetrate sealed environment suits and even power armor, and it killed by causing infected organisms to violently lyse, essentially melting them from the inside out into a contaminated soup of organic matter. 12 billion people died in the first minutes of the bombardment. The psychic death scream of so many souls dying simultaneously was said to be brighter than the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guides ships through the warp. Psykers across half the galaxy felt it, a wave of absolute terror and anguish that rippled through the Imperium. The Chaos Gods, feeding on emotion as they do, were glutted on the feast, and the Emperor, sitting upon his throne on Terra, felt something was deeply, catastrophically wrong. But the virus bombing didn't achieve its primary objective. Some of the Loyalist Space Marines survived. They'd been warned at the last moment by Loyalist officers who'd discovered the plan. Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard and Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children both risked everything to get word to the surface. Tarvitz personally commandeered a Thunderhawk and flew through the virus bomb barrage to deliver his warning, while Garrow managed to get a Vox message through before the fleet's communications were locked down. Thanks to these warnings, thousands of Loyalist Space Marines managed to find shelter in sealed structures, bunkers designed to withstand orbital bombardment and equipped with their own air supplies. They survived the initial virus release, though they emerged to find their world transformed into a nightmare. The entire planetary surface was covered in a putrid sludge of liquefied organic matter. The atmosphere was thick with methane and other gases produced by the rapid decay of every living thing on the planet. And hanging in the air was the horrific knowledge that their own Primarchs had just tried to murder them. Horus wasn't finished. The gases produced by the decaying organic matter made the atmosphere incredibly flammable. He ordered his flagship to fire on the planet, igniting a firestorm that consumed the entire surface. Cities melted. Mountains cracked and crumbled. The hives and structures that had housed billions were reduced to slag and ash. The heat was so intense that it created a global hurricane of fire, winds howling at speeds that tore apart anything not secured firmly to the ground. The Loyalists huddled in their shelters and listened to the world ending around them. But even this wasn't enough to kill them all. When the firestorm finally burned itself out, the surviving Loyalists emerged into ruins. They were battered, diminished, and horrified by what had been done to them, but they were still alive. And they were angry. Captain Garviel Loken of the Sons of Horus, Saul Tarvitz, Captain Erlen of the World Eaters, and other survivors organized a desperate defense in the ruins of the Coral City. The subsequent battle lasted 3 months. It should have lasted days at most. The Loyalists were vastly outnumbered, completely cut off from any hope of reinforcement or rescue, fighting on a devastated world against enemies who could simply bombard them from orbit whenever they wished. But they fought with the fury of betrayal, with the desperation of men who knew they were dead either way and wanted to take as many traitors with them as possible. They turned the ruins of the Coral City into a fortress, using the very devastation Horus had inflicted against his own forces. The battle became a meat grinder. Angron, overcome with rage that the virus bombing hadn't killed all the Loyalists, deployed to the surface with 50 companies of World Eaters, directly violating Horus's orders. The other Primarchs were forced to follow, committing more and more troops to a battle that was supposed to have been finished before it started. The Loyalists made them pay for every meter of ground in Space Marine blood, extracting a toll that shocked the traitor legions. Captain Tarvitz proved to be a brilliant defensive commander, outmaneuvering enemy forces far larger than his own and turning every building, every pile of rubble, every crater into a defensive position. Garviel Loken led counterattacks with such ferocity that even World Eaters gave ground before him. The Loyalists coordinated their defense with a level of skill that made mockery of the traitor legion's numerical advantage. They were fighting not just for survival, but for honor, for the memory of the Emperor they'd served, for vengeance against the brothers who'd betrayed them. The battle only ended when Horus, frustrated by the delay and the casualties, ordered a systematic orbital bombardment of the Coral City. This wasn't the pinpoint strikes that had been used earlier. This was a sustained barrage designed to literally pulverize the ruins and everything in them. The Loyalists had no defense against it. They died as heroes, standing firm in the ruins as the bombardment reduced the entire Coral City to powder and their bodies to atoms. When the bombardment finally ceased, Istvan III was lifeless, not just depopulated but sterile. The virus bombing had killed every living thing. The firestorm had burned away the organic residue, and the orbital bombardment had reduced the planet's cities to craters and dust. The world that had once housed 12 billion people was now a barren sphere of blasted rock. its surface resembling nothing so much as an enormous graveyard where the tombstones had all been ground to dust. Istvan III remains a dead world to this day. It's been quarantined by imperial order, marked as a site of extreme contamination, though the real reason for the quarantine has more to do with preventing knowledge of the Horus heresy from spreading than any physical danger. The planet serves as an unofficial memorial to the first victims of the heresy, the Space Marines, who remained loyal when their primarchs fell, who fought and died rather than betray their oaths to the Emperor. What makes Istvan III so deeply disturbing isn't the scale of death, though 12 billion casualties would be horrific by any standard. It's the betrayal. This was the moment when the Imperium's facade of unity was shattered irrevocably. The Space Marine legions had been the Emperor's greatest achievement, transhuman warriors who were supposed to be incorruptible, commanded by primarchs who were essentially demigods. The idea that they could turn against their creator, that sons could betray their father, that brothers could murder brothers, was so fundamentally wrong that the Imperium has spent 10,000 years trying to come to terms with it and still hasn't really succeeded. Istvan III also demonstrates the calculated cruelty of the traitor legions. They didn't simply kill their loyalist brothers in quick battles or assassinations. They engineered an elaborate trap, deployed them to a combat zone, and then virus-bombed the planet beneath their feet. They forced these Space Marines to watch billions of innocents die, to emerge into a world of liquefied corpses, to survive a global firestorm, only to face betrayal from the brothers they'd fought beside for decades or centuries. The psychological torture was as much a part of the attack as the physical violence. The planet stands as a warning about what can happen when faith in leadership is misplaced, when the assumption of loyalty proves false, when the bonds of brotherhood are revealed to be weaker than the temptations of chaos. Every dead world in the Imperium tells a story, but Istvan III's story is perhaps the most bitter because it didn't have to happen. The world wasn't consumed by Tyranids or shattered by orcs. It died because the Warmaster Horus chose to betray everything he'd once stood for, and millions paid the price for his corruption. Krieg, where atonement never ends. Among the Imperium's countless worlds, few demonstrate humanity's capacity for self-inflicted horror, quite like Krieg. This isn't a demon world corrupted by chaos. It's not a Xenos-ravaged planet transformed by alien invasion. Krieg is what happens when humans make choices, terrible choices motivated by loyalty and desperation, and then refuse to ever let go of the consequences. It's a world where an entire civilization turned itself into a permanent memorial to shame, where countless billions live and die as penance for crimes committed by ancestors they never knew, where hope has been systematically extinguished and replaced with grim fatalism, taken to its absolute extreme. Krieg was once a prosperous hive world in the Segmentum Tempestus. With a population numbering in the billions, it served as both a manufacturing center and a trading hub, contributing to the Imperium's economy while enjoying a relatively comfortable existence by 41st millennium standards. The planet was ruled by a council of autocrats, wealthy and powerful individuals who controlled the hives and the industrial base. For centuries, this system functioned adequately, if not admirably, providing the Imperium with the resources it demanded while maintaining a reasonable standard of living for the population. But over time, the autocrats changed. They became paranoid, seeing threats everywhere, convinced that external forces sought to take their power. They began fortifying Krieg against attack, diverting resources into defensive systems and military buildup. This paranoia was likely fed by chaos influence, though whether direct or simply the natural progression of power-mad leaders is unclear. Eventually, the autocrats began to resent the Administratum's authority over their world. In their minds, Krieg belonged to them, not to some distant bureaucracy on Terra. In 433 M40, approximately 1500 years before the current setting, the High Autocrat made the fatal decision. He declared Krieg's independence from the Imperium, an act of rebellion that could only end in disaster. The autocrats mobilized their military forces, prepared their fortifications, and waited for the imperial response they knew would come. They'd calculated that the Imperium was stretched too thin to respond effectively, that by the time a force could be assembled to retake Krieg, they'd have established enough defensive capability to make the cost prohibitive. They miscalculated in one crucial area. They didn't account for the possibility that the Imperium's response wouldn't come from outside. A significant portion of Krieg's population remained loyal to the Emperor, and among these loyalists was Colonel Jurten of the 83rd Krieg Imperial Guard Regiment. This officer and his troops refused to accept the autocrats' rebellion. They fought back, beginning a civil war that would consume the planet for generations. The civil war went poorly for the loyalists at first. The autocrats controlled most of the planet's military resources, had the support of the majority of Krieg's armed forces, and held all the major hive cities. Colonel Jurten and his followers were forced into a fighting retreat, gradually losing ground as the secessionists' superior numbers and firepower took their toll. Defeat seemed inevitable. The loyalists would be crushed, and Krieg would remain in rebellion until the Imperium could muster the forces needed to retake it, a process that might take decades. But Colonel Jurten made a decision that would echo through the centuries. If he couldn't defeat the secessionists through conventional warfare, he'd deny them the planet entirely. On the day of the feast of the Emperor's Ascension, a holy day in the imperial calendar, Jurten launched what became known as the Purging. He ordered a massive atomic strike on Krieg, unleashing nuclear weapons across the entire planetary surface. For days, Krieg burned under nuclear fire. Thousands of atomic warheads detonated in carefully orchestrated patterns designed to maximize devastation. Hive cities were vaporized in nuclear fireballs. Manufactoria melted into slag. Forests and farmlands were reduced to radioactive ash. The planet's ecosystem, such as it was for a hive world, collapsed entirely. And when the detonations finally ceased, Krieg was trapped in a nuclear winter that would last for centuries. The surface temperature dropped catastrophically. What little sunlight penetrated the thick clouds of radioactive ash provided no warmth. The survivors, both loyalist and secessionist, were forced underground to escape the toxic atmosphere and lethal radiation levels. But the war didn't end. It continued in the tunnels and bunkers, in the underground hive cities, across a planet where simply stepping outside meant death from radiation exposure within minutes. For 500 years, the descendants of both sides fought in the darkness. The original combatants died long ago, but their children and grandchildren carried on the conflict. This wasn't warfare in any conventional sense. There were no grand strategies, no brilliant tactical maneuvers. It was attrition warfare at its most brutal, measured in meters of tunnel gained or lost, in bunkers stormed and held, in millions of lives expended for infinitesimal progress. The Loyalists, the descendants of Jurten's original force, gradually developed a particular philosophy. They'd destroyed their own world to prevent its use by traitors. This action, while perhaps militarily justified, had killed billions of innocents. The radiation and nuclear winter had claimed far more lives than the actual warfare. An entire ecosystem had been rendered permanently sterile. Krieg could never be restored to what it was. These loyalists felt profound guilt for what they'd done, a shame so deep that it fundamentally transformed their culture. This shame became the organizing principle of Krieg society. The population came to believe that their ancestors had committed an unforgivable sin by rebelling against the Emperor, and that Jurten's nuclear response, while necessary, had compounded this sin. The only way to atone was through service and sacrifice. Every Krieger must dedicate their life to the Imperium, must be willing to die to redeem their planet's honor. Death in service to the Emperor became not just acceptable, but desirable, the only meaningful form of redemption available. Over the 5 centuries of civil war, this philosophy was refined and intensified. The Loyalists began training their children from birth to be soldiers. They created an entire education system devoted to producing warriors who would never question orders, never retreat, never value their own lives above the mission. They eliminated concepts of individuality and personal identity, reducing citizens to numbers rather than names. They built a society where the only measure of worth was willingness to die for the Imperium. Finally, in 949 M40, the Loyalists achieved complete victory. The last secessionist strongholds fell, the final traitor elements were purged, and Krieg was returned to Imperial control. The victory report that reached Terra was dry and bureaucratic, noting that compliance had been restored after a civil war lasting 500 years. The Departamento Munitorum took note of the planet's status and assessed it for future service. What they found both impressed and disturbed them. Krieg was a ruined world, its surface still toxic and radioactive 1,500 years later. The population lived entirely underground in subterranean hive cities, surviving on nutrient paste and recycled water. Life expectancy was low, even for those not in military service. But the planet had turned itself into a military-industrial complex of frightening efficiency. It could produce soldiers in vast quantities, and these soldiers were unlike any other Imperial Guard regiments. When the Munitorum demanded a tithe of troops, expecting perhaps a few regiments, Krieg's authorities offered 20 fully equipped and trained regiments immediately, with more to follow. The commanders of these regiments specifically requested deployment to the most dangerous war zones available. This wasn't bravado or false confidence. It was a genuine desire to die in combat, to earn redemption through sacrifice on the battlefield. Thus was born the Death Corps of Krieg, one of the most effective and most deeply disturbing military forces in the entire Imperium. These soldiers are raised from birth to embrace death. They're trained in environments so harsh that the training itself kills a significant percentage of candidates. Those who survive become perfect soldiers in many ways: disciplined, skilled, unshakably brave, and willing to follow orders without question. They're also completely dead inside, emotionally, incapable of joy or hope, or any feeling except grim determination. The Death Corps are identifiable by their distinctive equipment. They wear heavy greatcoats designed for trench warfare, reminiscent of soldiers from the First World War of ancient Terra. Their helmets and rebreathers give them a skull-like appearance, an effect that's entirely deliberate. They want to look like death. They want the enemy to see them as implacable, inevitable, unstoppable forces of destruction. And to a large extent, this psychological warfare is effective. Facing the Death Corps in battle is an exercise in horror, watching as soldiers advance through artillery fire and machine gun nests, never flinching, never retreating, dying in droves, but never stopping. Krieg now exists solely to produce these soldiers. The Departamento Munitorum has set the planet's tithe grade at the absolute maximum, demanding over 50 million soldiers per year. Krieg consistently meets this quota and offers more. The entire planetary economy is geared toward war production. Forges produce weapons and equipment. Training facilities process millions of recruits. And the Vitae Womb facilities, using technology that skirts the edges of what the Imperium considers acceptable, produce additional population to replace the soldiers constantly being tithed away. The Vitae Womb system is itself disturbing. While not full cloning, which the Imperium generally prohibits due to genetic instability concerns, it's close enough to make many uncomfortable. Fertilized embryos are grown in artificial wombs, accelerated to maturity, and then processed through the training system that turns them into Death Corps troopers. This allows Krieg to maintain its population despite losing tens of millions of soldiers annually. It also ensures that the Death Corps' particular psychological conditioning can be applied from the earliest moments of development. Life for a civilian on Krieg is arguably worse than life for a soldier. Civilians live in the underground hives, working in factories and production facilities, under conditions that would be considered inhumane on most worlds. They subsist on nutrient paste, that barely meets caloric requirements. They work 12-hour shifts or longer. Industrial accidents are common and rarely investigated. Medical care is minimal. Recreation is non-existent. And hanging over everything is the knowledge that the planet's only real purpose is to produce soldiers for the Imperium, that every civilian exists only to support that goal. The population accepts this because they've been taught from birth that they bear collective guilt for their ancestors' rebellion. The fact that this rebellion happened 1500 years ago, that no one alive today had anything to do with it, doesn't matter. The shame is inherited, passed from one generation to the next, constantly reinforced through propaganda and religious indoctrination. The imperial cult on Krieg has been adapted to emphasize themes of sin, redemption through sacrifice, and the absolute necessity of atonement. What makes Krieg particularly disturbing is that it's self-sustaining. This isn't a system imposed by external forces or maintained through violence and fear, though both of those elements are present. It's a culture that has voluntarily chosen to perpetuate itself in this form. The people of Krieg genuinely believe that this is how they should live. They accept the grim conditions, the constant death, the erasure of individual identity, because they think it's their duty. The death corps themselves exemplify this mindset. Commissars are attached to death corps regiments not to maintain discipline or improve morale, as would be normal for Imperial Guard units. The death corps need no such encouragement. Instead, commissars are there to prevent the death corps from being too eager to die. Without oversight, death corps commanders will sacrifice their entire force in suicide charges if they think it might achieve a tactical objective. They need to be reminded that sometimes preserving your force for future battles is strategically superior to glorious death today. The training regimen on Krieg is itself a form of horror. Young recruits are subjected to constant drilling in weapons use, tactics, and the construction of defensive positions. They're taught that their lives have no value except as tools to serve the Emperor. They're conditioned to suppress all personal desires, all individual thought, all emotion except devotion to duty. And as a final test, they're forced to perform training exercises on Krieg's toxic surface, fighting mock battles in an environment where merely breathing the air would be lethal without their rebreathers. The casualty rate during training is significant. Many recruits die during the surface exercises from equipment failure, radiation exposure, or simple bad luck. Those who survive have proven they can endure conditions that would kill most humans. They've also been thoroughly stripped of whatever humanity they started with. They're no longer individuals with hopes and dreams and personal identities. They're numbers, components in the imperial war machine, weapons to be deployed and expended as tactical necessity demands. Krieg stands as perhaps the ultimate example of the Imperium's capacity for self-inflicted suffering. This wasn't done by Xenos invaders or chaos corruption. Humans did this to themselves, and they continue to do it, generation after generation. A world that could have been rebuilt, a population that could have been allowed to move past their ancestors' mistakes, has instead been frozen in a state of permanent penance. And the truly disturbing part is that from the Imperium's perspective, this arrangement works perfectly. Krieg produces excellent soldiers in vast quantities, soldiers who never question orders and never retreat. Why would anyone want to change such an efficient system? Katakan, where everything wants you dead. When most people think of dangerous planets in Warhammer 40k, their minds turn to demon worlds or battlefields. But there exists a category of world that predates human presence in the galaxy entirely, that requires no corruption or warfare to be lethal, death worlds. And among these nightmare landscapes, none is more infamous than Katahan. Located in the Ultima Segmentum, this jungle world represents what happens when evolution takes a distinctly hostile turn, when an entire ecosystem develops with the apparent goal of killing any human foolish enough to set foot on it. Katahan's surface is covered almost entirely by dense jungle. The vegetation grows with such aggressive vigor that it can reclaim cleared areas in days. The canopy is so thick that sunlight barely penetrates to the ground level, creating a perpetual twilight beneath the trees. The air is hot and humid, saturated with moisture and spores and things that shouldn't be able to live in air. The smell is overwhelming, a mixture of decay and growth and predation that assaults the senses and never relents. But the jungle's aggressive growth is the least of Katakan's horrors. The planet's entire ecosystem seems consciously hostile to human life. Every element of the native flora and fauna represents a real danger, from the smallest insect to the largest predator, from the innocuous-looking plants to the trees themselves. There is quite literally nothing on Katakan that won't try to kill you if given the opportunity. Start with the plants. Katakan is home to countless species of carnivorous vegetation. Some use chemical attractants to lure prey close before striking with vine-like tendrils. Others are more passive, waiting for something to brush against their leaves before releasing toxins that paralyze or dissolve flesh. Still others actually hunt, using slow but relentless movement to pursue prey across the jungle floor. One documented species can extend root systems to follow the vibrations of footsteps, erupting from the ground beneath unwary travelers. The trees are equally dangerous. Some species have developed a form of defensive mechanism where they explode violently when damaged, launching wooden shrapnel in all directions at velocities sufficient to penetrate flak armor. Others secrete oils that are flammable, potentially corrosive, or poisonous, or all three simultaneously. The concept of a safe tree to take shelter under doesn't exist on Katakan. Any tree might kill you. The only question is how. Then there's the animal life, and this is where Katakan's reputation truly originates. The Katakan devil is perhaps the most famous predator, a creature that resembles nothing so much as a dinosaur crossbred with a shark and given preternatural intelligence. These apex predators can grow to enormous size, hunt in packs when convenient, and have been known to stalk, prey for days, learning their habits before striking. They're strong enough to tear through light armor, fast enough to catch most prey despite their size, and cunning enough to set ambushes. Barking toads are another infamous species, and their name is deceptively innocuous. These amphibians are highly territorial and respond to perceived threats by inflating their bodies to extreme proportions and then violently exploding, releasing a toxic mist that can kill everything in a wide radius. The explosion is powerful enough to injure or kill anyone standing too close, even without considering the poison. Walking through Katakan jungle means constantly watching for these toads and giving them a wide berth, but in dense jungle, that's not always possible. Katakan face-eaters are exactly what their name suggests. These creatures are parasitic organisms that attach to hosts and slowly consume their facial features, burrowing into the skull while keeping the host alive as long as possible. They're small enough to be nearly invisible in the jungle's perpetual twilight, making them almost impossible to spot before they strike. Infection is effectively a death sentence without immediate medical intervention, and even then, survival rates are poor. The list continues almost endlessly. Brainleaf is a plant whose spores can penetrate the blood-brain barrier and cause madness. Spica are insects whose stings inject flesh-eating bacteria. Katakan screaming birds make sounds that can rupture eardrums at close range. Every water source is potentially contaminated with organisms that can kill from the inside. Even the air itself carries enough fungal spores and bacterial content that breathing without a filter for extended periods leads to respiratory infections that are often fatal. What makes Katakan especially disturbing is that it's not the result of chaos corruption or Xenos bioengineering. This is what nature produced, left to its own devices on a planet with conditions that favored aggressive evolutionary strategies. The ecosystem has reached a state of hypercompetition where every organism must be lethal just to survive, because everything else is equally lethal. Its violence and predation elevated to an organizing principle that governs the entire biosphere. Despite all this, humans live on Katakan. The population isn't large by imperial standards, maybe a few million at most, but they've managed to survive and even develop a distinctive culture. The Katakans have adapted to their environment through a combination of natural selection, constant vigilance, and what can only be described as sheer bloody-mindedness. They're among the toughest humans in the entire Imperium, physically and mentally hardened by a lifetime of living in an environment that tries to kill them daily. Katakan's only valuable resource is its people. The Astra Militarum's Katakan jungle fighters regiments are legendary throughout the Imperium, elite light infantry, specialists who can survive and operate in environments that would break other soldiers. They're masters of jungle warfare, experts at stealth and ambush, and utterly fearless in the face of danger. When you've survived childhood on Katakan, facing orcs or tyranids, or even Chaos Space Marines seems almost manageable by comparison. The training for becoming a Katakan jungle fighter isn't formal in the traditional sense. There are no drill sergeants or structured programs. If you survive childhood on Katakan, you've already passed every test that matters. You've learned to move silently through vegetation that transmits vibrations. You've developed reflexes fast enough to avoid ambush predators. You've mastered the art of identifying threats before they can strike. You've become so attuned to your environment that you can sense danger through subtle cues that other humans would never notice. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Katakan is that even chaos couldn't conquer it. During the 13th Black Crusade, when the Great Rift tore across the galaxy and demon invasions struck thousands of worlds, Katakan was among those targeted. Demons manifested across the planet, expecting to find terrified humans ripe for corruption or slaughter. Instead, they found an ecosystem that didn't care about the warp or corruption or the will of the Chaos Gods. The jungle of Katakan attacked the demons with the same murderous efficiency it applied to everything else. The native creatures proved capable of killing demons. The plants adapted to drain warp energy as readily as they adapted to any other food source. The environment itself seemed to reject the demonic presence, as if Katakan's biosphere recognized an invasive species and mobilized to eliminate it. When Imperial forces finally arrived to provide relief, they found the demon incursion had already been largely eliminated by the planet's natural defenses. Katakan was one of the few worlds near the Great Rift that needed no rescuing when Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade arrived. This event has led to considerable speculation about the nature of Katakan's ecosystem. Some Margot's biologists theorize that the planet's biosphere is semi-sentient in some collective way, that the competitive pressures have created a form of planetary consciousness that recognizes and eliminates external threats. Others argue it's simply that Katakan's life forms are so aggressive that they'd attack anything unusual, demon or otherwise. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes, but the fact remains, Katakan might be the only place in the Imperium where the warp itself is actively repelled by natural life. Life expectancy on Katakan is low. Most inhabitants don't live past 40, killed by disease, predation, accidents, or simple bad luck. The survivors are extraordinary individuals, humans pushed to their absolute physical and mental limits by an environment that offers no mercy and no second chances. They develop a particular mindset, a combination of fatalism and determination that makes them simultaneously pessimistic about survival odds and absolutely committed to fighting for every day of life they can claim. The population centers on Katashan are minimal. There are no hive cities, no sprawling metropolises, just small settlements, usually built around clearings that are constantly defended against the encroaching jungle. Even these settlements aren't truly safe. Predators regularly penetrate the perimeters. Plant life must be constantly cut back, or it will overrun structures in weeks. And occasionally, entire settlements are simply wiped out overnight by some mass predator attack or emerging plant species that the inhabitants didn't recognize as dangerous quickly enough. Education on Katakan focuses almost entirely on survival skills. Children learn to identify threats, to move through the jungle, to fight hand-to-hand against creatures that outweigh them by hundreds of kilograms. Academic education is minimal because it's largely irrelevant to survival. Reading and writing are useful, but not as useful as knowing which plants are edible and which will kill you, which sounds mean a predator is close and which mean one is hunting something else. How to treat wounds with materials available in the jungle, because no medical supplies are reliable enough in Katakan's humid environment. The planet produces very little in terms of material goods. Its environment makes large-scale industry essentially impossible. Mining operations constantly face attacks from the jungle. Manufacturing facilities require such intensive security that production costs are prohibitive. Agriculture is equally impractical when the crops are competing with vegetation that grows at many times the rate of domesticated plants. So Katakan contributes to the Imperium in the one way it can, by providing soldiers who are already among the toughest humans alive. The Departamento Munitorum sets relatively modest tithes for Katakan because the population is small. But what the planet lacks in quantity, it makes up for in quality. A single Katakan regiment can be worth 3 or 4 regiments from less harsh worlds. They excel in jungle warfare, obviously, but they also perform exceptionally well in any environment that requires adaptability, quick thinking, and the ability to improvise with limited resources. They're the troops you send when the mission is impossible and conventional forces would fail. What makes Katakan most disturbing isn't the lethality of its ecosystem, though that's certainly remarkable. It's what the planet represents about the universe itself. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, humans face countless threats: chaos, xenos, heretics, rogue AI, the forces of entropy itself. But Katakan reminds us that nature, untouched by any of these factors, can be just as deadly. You don't need demonic corruption or alien invasion to create a hell world. Sometimes evolution alone is sufficient. The planet also serves as a metaphor for the Imperium's approach to human life. Katakan is maintained as an inhabited world, not out of any concern for its population, but because that population has proven useful as a military resource. If the Katakan jungle fighters weren't so effective, there would be no reason to keep humans on such a deadly planet. They'd be evacuated, and Katakan would be marked as too dangerous for colonization. But because the harsh environment produces superior soldiers, the population is maintained, allowed to suffer and die generation after generation for the Imperium's benefit. Closing thoughts on a galaxy of horrors. We've journeyed across some of the most disturbing locations in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, from demon worlds where reality itself has been corrupted to planets where humanity has inflicted unspeakable horrors upon itself. Each of these places tells us something about the setting and the themes that make it so compelling, despite, or perhaps because of, its relentless darkness. The Daemon worlds, the Plague Planet, Sortiarius, Medrengard, and Sicarus represent the ultimate corruption. These aren't simply conquered territories. They're transformed at a fundamental level, places where the normal laws of physics have been replaced by the whims of malevolent gods. They show us what happens when chaos achieves total victory, when the barrier between the material universe and the warp dissolves entirely. And perhaps most disturbing, they demonstrate that this transformation is permanent. These worlds cannot be reclaimed. They're lost forever, eternal monuments to humanity's failure to protect itself from corruption. Istvan III represents something different. The moment when everything changed. This is where the Horus heresy began in earnest, where the facade of unity was shattered, where brother turned against brother in the most literal sense. The planet stands as a memorial to betrayal, and to the loyalists who refused to betray their oaths, even when their own primarchs had fallen to darkness. It's a reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, loyalty and honor still matter, even if they often lead only to death. Krieg shows us humanity's capacity for self-inflicted suffering. This is a world that destroyed itself and then refused to rebuild, instead choosing to transform its entire civilization into a permanent act of penance. It's disturbing not because of external threats, but because it demonstrates how thoroughly humans can be conditioned to accept misery as normal, how guilt can be weaponized and perpetuated across generations, how an entire planet can be turned into a factory for producing soldiers who genuinely want to die. And Katakan reminds us that sometimes nature itself is the enemy. You don't need chaos or xenos or any external threat. Sometimes evolution creates monsters, and sometimes entire ecosystems become death traps, where merely existing requires constant struggle against an environment that's actively trying to kill you. These planets exist within a broader context of a galaxy consumed by war, a setting where the baseline condition for most humans is misery and suffering, where hope is a luxury few can afford, and where the best most people can aspire to is a quick death rather than a slow one. They're the extreme examples, the worst of the worst, but they're not aberrations. They're natural extensions of the Imperium's brutal logic, where human life is measured in terms of utility and resources, where entire populations exist only to serve the endless war machine. The Warhammer 40,000 universe is fundamentally about entropy and decay, about civilizations fighting desperately to hold back darkness that presses in from every side. These disturbing planets represent what happens when the darkness wins, when the defenses fail, when the struggle ends in defeat. They're cautionary tales, warnings about the costs of rebellion, corruption, desperation, and simple bad luck in a universe that offers no forgiveness and no second chances. But they also serve as context for heroism. The Space Marines who fight to reclaim or destroy these worlds, the Imperial Guard regiments who deploy to battlefields, knowing they'll probably die, the Inquisitors who investigate chaos corruption, knowing that what they learn might destroy their souls. All these individuals are fighting against odds that would break lesser people. Their heroism is meaningful precisely because the setting is so horrific, because every victory is temporary and every loss is permanent, because serving the Imperium means accepting that you're fighting a war that will never end and can never be truly won. If you found this exploration of the galaxy's darkest corners interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There's so much more to explore in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, from the greatest victories to the most catastrophic defeats, from the noblest heroes to the most depraved villains. And if you have suggestions for future topics you'd like to see covered, please leave them in the comments below. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.